for coming. I'm really excited for our panel discussion today. I'm just going to give you a brief background of our student group, and then we'll have a brief description of our findings before we start the discussion today. Georgetown Human Rights Action is a student group dedicated to constructive human rights advocacy, both within and beyond the law center community. Our research in Guatemala concerning gangs was the second of 3 fact-finding missions organized by HURRA and generously funded by the Dean's Office. The purpose of the fact-finding mission is to identify a United States policy that has human rights implications both here and abroad, and gather information that might not be widely available, illustrating the effects of the policy. Question. Our group then partners with advocacy efforts to disseminate the information learned and lobby for changes that will make U.S. policy more effective and more humane. Dan Berlin will now present a brief outline of our research and our findings. Thank you, Dan.
Hi, everybody. First off, if you guys haven't noticed, we have food in the back now, and please feel free to shuffle around and get lunch while I'm speaking, because I know you're all here to hear the panelists anyway. Thank you all for coming. The students involved in this project have been deeply invested in these issues for the past year and a half, and it's wonderful to see so many other people who care enough about problems surrounding gang violence to take time out of their afternoons to come to this event. I especially want to thank all of our panelists because we feel it's extremely important to have such a wide array of viewpoints on this issue, and we're thrilled to have the opportunity of divergent voices in this dialogue. Without collaboration between all of the different institutional actors, effective solutions to youth violence will be impossible. Before we hand things over to the panelists, I'm going to discuss a little more about how this project came to be. As Erica mentioned, Georgetown Law Center and the Dean's Office have graciously presented students the opportunity to structure fact-finding missions over the past 3 years. The students involved in this fact-finding mission wanted to take advantage of the opportunity to look at an issue that was controversial, misunderstood, and that focused on a population that many organizations feel they cannot spend their scarce resources on. We ultimately decided that a project that looked at what happened to former and current gang members who the U.S. deported to Central America would satisfy this criteria. As the group began to investigate this issue, we discovered we were correct in our assumptions. The topic was certainly controversial. A common question we encountered in the initial planning stage was, why will anybody even care about what happens to gang members who are deported? This question helped affirm that the topic was misunderstood. Although a significant portion of the U.S. population may say good riddance to sending supposed criminals back to wherever they're from, a surprisingly wide range of commentators recognize that this is a much more nuanced issue. That sending troubled kids back to war-torn countries to which they have little connection and where they may well be murdered is neither effective in crime prevention nor is it humane. To gather information for this project, we spoke with a broad array of advocates, academics, law and policymakers, law enforcement, government officials, and most importantly, former and active gang members and other community members affected by youth violence. Amid media portrayals of demonic teens with tattooed faces, armed with machetes and hand grenades, we wanted to see for ourselves who was actually being deported and what was happening to them once they returned to their home countries. We visited ICE detention centers throughout Virginia with the CARE Coalition, and we spoke with young men and women awaiting deportation to Central America. We then traveled to Guatemala, where we worked closely with youth violence prevention workers to speak with former and active gang members and young people at risk of joining gangs. We also spoke with a broad range of law enforcement officials working in gang suppression. We met one of the daily chartered plane loads of deportees that the U.S. is sending to Guatemala. And we visited prisons where we spoke to men and women jailed for gang-related activities. The more we investigated, the more we realized how complex this issue is. Youth violence, both here and in Guatemala, is real and is devastating. At least one of our interviewees, a reformed gang member who was working with USAID's reintegration program in Guatemala, has since been murdered. Some of the young men we spoke to have committed horrific acts of violence. Many are simply troubled teenagers who, given a different set of options, would develop into productive, well-adjusted members of society. All of the youth that we spoke with face some level of discrimination and isolation. In the U.S., this manifests itself in the denial of public services, lack of educational and employment opportunities, racial profiling, arbitrary arrests and harassment, and constant risk of deportation. Young people in Guatemala face similar discrimination, along with the real possibility of being killed by the police, vigilante groups, or other non-state actors. Fear is pervasive among gang members, ex-gang members, and the communities affected by gang violence. This fear causes tension between advocates, law enforcement, and civil society, as well as among different groups of advocates. Whereas everybody has the same broader goal of working for a less violent community, political and institutional pressure, as well as divergent theories as to what works, creates a situation in which institutional actors distrust each other and feel that one group's work undermines the progress of another. We've been struggling for the past several months to compile all of the information that we gathered into a coherent story, which we will release next week in our report, Between the Border and the Street, Migrant Youth on the Margins. If you all are interested in receiving a copy of the report, please make sure your email address is on the list at the front, or that we'll be passing around. It should be ready by next week. Before we finalize this report, we wanted to hear our panelists' views this afternoon. In the report, we give a wide range of recommendations about how we feel problems of youth violence, both here and in Guatemala, can best be addressed. However, the most important finding of our investigation is that we need to have more dialogue between the institutional actors. We need community organizations, youth violence prevention workers, law enforcement, and lawmakers to work together for the common goal of protecting our children and our communities. We hope that this discussion today will be a step towards achieving this goal. Thank you.
Thank you, Dan. Okay, we're going to get started with our panel presentations. First up is Shay Bilchik. He's the founder and director of the Center for Juvenile Justice Reform at Georgetown University's Public Policy Institute. Prior to joining the Institute, Mr. Bilchik was the president and CEO of the Child Welfare League of America. In 2001, 2004, 2005, and 2006, he was named among the nonprofit Times Power Influence Top 50 for making his mark in the public policy arena, championing child welfare issues. Prior to his tenure at the Child Welfare League of America, Shay headed up the Office of Juvenile Justice and Delinquency Prevention in the U.S. Department of Justice, where he advocated for and supported a balanced multi-systems approach to attacking juvenile crime. Before coming to the nation's capital, Mr. Bilchik was an assistant state attorney in Miami, Florida from 1977 to 1993, where he served as a trial lawyer, juvenile division chief, and chief assistant state attorney. Please join me in welcoming Mr. Shay Bilchik.
Thank you. It's great to be here. I have a desire to start with two observations. One, that this gathering is serving multiple purposes. So I can tell that for the students at Georgetown, this is a potential break as you enter the stretch run for final exams. We're going to feed you well, get your energy up. And Erica, I've noticed that actually there are students from around the law school now filtering in and filtering out with their food. So you are serving the student body writ large with this event today. So well done. The other observation deals with this report. And I think that as we have this discussion today, and as people react to it, as it begins to be disseminated a week from now, there'll be a lot of different takeaways in terms of this report. And one thing that no one will be able to claim is that it is not thorough. The group of students who devoted themselves to this work worked exhaustively in trying to mine the information that's out there, understand the issues, and then present a platform, a set of positions on what is happening to these young people, what's happening to their families, that is ripe for discussion and is ripe for us to address in terms of national policy, as well as state and local policy. So I really want to commend the group of students who devoted an incredible amount of energy and thought to creating this report. So please join me in acknowledging that. So I'm up here, I think, for about 10 to 15 minutes. Okay, and I've got my cue cards down here. As maybe the obligatory Georgetown staff member, but also, I think, to contribute to this discussion by laying out some of the issues around gang violence writ large, how we are approaching this issue, how we are impacted by this issue, what the extent of this issue is nationally, and then begin to explore how that intersects with the immigration issues that the report so well explores. So let me mention, as Erica did, that my background is both as a local prosecutor, an official at the U.S. Department of Justice, and someone who worked on the child welfare side, the pathway side that so many young people follow into either a positive, productive life or into dysfunction, school dropout, crime, mental health issues, substance abuse problems. So I've experienced those things as a professional on multiple levels. And what we've seen in that work is that in general, young people follow a pathway from first signs of trouble into delinquency of about 7 years. There's a 7-year window we have of being able to spot these issues and do something about them. And again, this is a broad application in this country. Now that is complicated based upon which particular young people we're talking about. And I think when we get down and drill down into the immigrant population of young people, it becomes the most complicated perhaps of all. But I want to paint the big picture first. And this will come out in the report in some depth. But we see that there's a trend line around gangs in this country, and some of our panelists will be able to define that and update that maybe from the data that I have. But that we saw from 1996 to 2004 a decrease in the actual number of gang members in this country from about 850,000 down to about 750,000. We saw a decrease during that same time period of gangs, acknowledged gangs, of 31,000 down to 24,000. And of jurisdictions that consider themselves plagued by a gang problem, going from 4,800 down to 2,900. So we've definitely seen a trend line in this country, unless there's a blip up from 2004 on. The most recent data I have nationally is 2004. So we have a couple of local state officials with us today who might be able to say what they're experiencing here in Maryland, for example, or elsewhere. What we also know that of our young people, only 1 to 2% of them will be involved in any gang during the course of their years of adolescence. That 8%, however, of 17-year-olds, so now we're going to narrow the population, 8% of 17-year-olds will have been involved in a gang during that age frame, 17. Most importantly, perhaps, and as impacts this overall discussion, that of those gang members that were surveyed, of the police departments that we contacted as I was doing some of this work at Justice and then the officials that followed, they saw that the gang members, half of them, were involved in the gangs 1 year or less. So what we see is that there's an entry into gang activity for many, many young people, and then an exit. Entry and exit. Now, there are still a substantial number of young people who enter and then will remain for longer periods of time. But when you extend the arc to 2 or 3 years, the vast majority of gang members have both entered and exit their gang life. Why is this important? It's important because during that time period, we are at a crisis point with these young people. We see that they are, while involved in the gang life, 3 times more likely to commit a break-in and entry, 4 times as likely to commit a felony theft, 8 times more likely to commit a robbery. The gang involvement elevates the likelihood of criminal activity significantly. Once they leave the gang, it diminishes. Before they enter the gang, it is a greatly lower level. It is the gang involvement itself that accelerates the level of gang activity. When studies were done in Rochester, New York, taking a look at high-risk youth, and then subdividing the population into those high-risk youth who were also gang members, they found that of the high-risk youth population, 30% of them were gang members. But those 30% constituted 54% of the arrests in Rochester, 68% of property crime arrests, 69% of violent crime arrests, 70% of drug arrests, and 82% of serious delinquency arrests. Similar data for Denver, similar data for Pittsburgh when those studies were also analyzed. When it comes to gangs, there's an easier access to guns while you are involved in a gang, and the stronger incentive to use that gun as the play of skill building, opportunities, recognition mount during the time that they're involved in the gang activity. And they're 10 times more likely to carry a gun while they are in a gang as opposed to the time period before they enter the gang as well as after they leave the gang. So the long-term impact of gang activity, gang life, is significant in terms of public safety. It is also significant about the individual life chances those young people have. They tend to drop out of school if they're in school. There tends to be a higher level of pregnancy or fathering a child. There is an unstable work life for these young people. Now, as we move this conversation into issues around an immigrant population, it becomes even more complicated. Because successful programs to reduce gang activity have these following levers in them. One, they are very comprehensive. They don't just use one strategy. They use a multifaceted strategy. They cut across various systems of care. So kids live in various domains. They live within their family life. They live within their school life. They live within the community. They live within a peer group, as well as addressing their own issues. So if we were going to impact their probability of entering or exiting a gang, and what happens while they're in that gang, we're going to have to work with multiple systems. We're going to need to address those multiple domains. And we're going to need to focus on family as a unit, on both their strengths and their needs. So you can begin to see how the picture becomes complicated when you have the variety of statuses of these young people. Some of them who are illegal immigrants themselves. Some of them have legal status, but their families are in illegal status. And when we look at how we create a comprehensive strategy, it interplays with what is our national policy around immigration and around the status of these young people and their families. Because if we're going to effectively design a comprehensive strategy, which is inclusive of immigrant children, some of whom are illegal immigrant children, then we need to understand these different dynamics and as they play out. Now, some will say, well, no, it's easy when it's an illegal immigrant family and illegal immigrant youth who's involved in gang activity. We simply arrest, we prosecute, and we deport. But as the report highlights, it may be more complicated than that. As was indicated in the opening comments, it may be more nuanced than that. And some communities are actually trying to take this issue on by understanding what the dynamic is of this population in their community and trying to open up their lens and how they view the issue more broadly. Understanding that there may be zero tolerance about criminal activity, but the issue about deportation and what you do over the long haul may be a different strategy. That may not be shared by the Immigration Department, but I think more local communities are trying to get their arms around how we developed a more comprehensive policy. When we use these comprehensive approaches, and I'm going to run out of time before I can get into them, we see that there are various characteristics of what makes the comprehensive gang reduction program successful. And I think some of the other panelists are going to talk about those strategies. So I'm looking to my left, looking for eye recognition about whether I continue or whether you're going to hit on those things. Okay. So I'm going to save this part for later, maybe during the Q&A if it needs to come up. But there are about 8 or 9 characteristics that we see when we look at the Boston Gun Reduction Project, or we look at Operation Ceasefire, that made those programs successful. To this day, in Chicago, for example, in Operation Ceasefire, how they're using this comprehensive strategy, almost blinded in a certain degree as local officials in Chicago as to whether the young people have legal or do not have legal status, in trying to create that net in working with all young people and all families who are living in those communities. So I think I'm going to step down at this point, but I think we need to think about, as we look at these strategies, several different factors that become the cross-cutting issues. One, how do we impact the domains that I mentioned when we're talking about this particular population? 2, how do we develop needed national immigration policy that coherently addresses the variety of circumstances that young people and their families find themselves in? And 3rd, how do we recognize then, for this population, the notion that since they do move in and out of gangs, and even if we deport them, they're likely to return, how do we then work with them while they're here, while they're in those gangs, to work in pulling them out rather than simply deporting them? Thank you very much.
Thank you so much, Shay. Next we have Detective Word. Since 1994, Detective Word has acted as Gaithersburg Police Department's gang investigator, working with local, state, and federal agencies, conducting investigations and intelligence gathering on local gangs. His current assignments include felony and violent crime investigations, gang investigations, and intelligence gathering. He's also served as the president and chair of the legislative committee of the Mid-Atlantic Regional Gang Investigators Network, an association of over 400 law enforcement professionals involved in intelligence, enforcement, and suppression of gang activity. Detective Word is the national secretary and an executive board member of the National Alliance of Gang Investigator Associations, the national board overseeing gang investigator associations in the U.S. and Canada, representing 20,000 members. He acts as a consultant for the National Youth Gang Center of the U.S. Department of Justice and has authored materials for use in national gang investigator training. He's a certified subject matter expert in the area of gangs, gang violence, gang investigations, and also worked in counterintelligence while serving in the U.S. Marine Corps. Please join me in welcoming Detective Ward.
Thank you. It's a pleasure to be here to get the local law enforcement perspective. And we appreciate it. We reviewed the study and was fascinated. The only thing I didn't see in the study was the idea, and I understand it's about immigration in Guatemala, but I didn't see anything about gang suppression strategies or any type of strategies that involve parenting issues. To me, parenting issues is the biggest problem that we've seen in the law enforcement side of it. Some of the numbers that Shay was talking about, numbers that went down over the years, there's two explanations as to why those gang numbers have gone down. Number one, that we did our jobs in law enforcement, and we reduced the number of gang members that are out there by locking them up, maybe deporting some. Or number two, which seems to be the most prevalent, once the gang issue became a major issue in this country, elected officials decided to change the terminology or change definitions, and they defined their gang problems away. If you contacted back in 1992, and I think Jeff and I have worked with this issue before, Los Angeles Police Department contacted Metropolitan Washington PD and said, hey, there's a new gang coming out your way to the East Coast, MS-13. They're a very violent gang. You guys need to take a look at these people. And Metropolitan Police's official response was, we have no gangs in the District of Columbia. Now, whether or not you believe that to be true, we all know that it is true. There are gangs. But D.C. was saying, we call them crews. So let's throw away these definitions right now. The other issue that we have in law enforcement is that a lot of agencies, there are no set standard of definitions for what gangs are and what gang members are. We've been working on that both at the federal and at a number of state level. The Feinstein-Hatch Act, which is in front of Congress now, it's over on the House side, finally passed the Senate, defines gangs under federal law. There was a lot of wrangling back and forth. That was the biggest issue. Not the fact that the issue has $1 billion. It's a $1 billion markup for a bill that is a suppression bill, a crime bill. But it also has in that bill $400 million towards intervention and prevention programs. So those of you who are here from nonprofits, start lining up. Once we get that, hopefully, once we get that passed, the House side, there's a lot of funding out there. But wrangling and fighting over definitions was the biggest problem. As I testified in front of the Senate Judiciary Committee, that was the question that kept coming up. Well, how do we define gangs? Some of the things, I have some basics for you today to show you what the basic definitions are of gangs. We're not calling every kid wearing baggy pants and a bandana a gang member. I mean, if we look at the current definitions of what are gangs, 3 or more subjects, these are the bare minimums that you must have to certify somebody as a gang or a group as a gang. 3 or more subjects, a common symbol or leadership or some type of identifier. But the key to this is that they're all gathering together to commit crimes or they're continuing criminal enterprise. So we're not just out there labeling any young person or any, and let's clear something up right away. In law enforcement, we don't look at it as differences between a youth issue and an adult issue. We look at that only when it comes to charging purposes. The average age of a gang member in the Mid-Atlantic region, the D.C.-Baltimore region, is 19. That's not a youth crime problem. That's an adult problem. The average age of a gang member that we're locking up in my jurisdiction is going to be 19 to 20 years old. So this is not just a youth problem. Some of these kids, by the time they get to me in my investigations and arrest, some of them are beyond help. They don't want help. They love being gang members. And if you talk to them, they will tell you that. I don't want out of the gang lifestyle. Don't try to reform me. But the issues go back to some underlying issues. This is my family. This is the only thing that I know. They haven't had alternatives. There are ways that we help out. We do try to get these kids, we try to intervene as much as we can. We're not just about hooking them up, throwing them in a cell, contrary to some popular beliefs. I am not a fan of deportation. Believe it or not, a police officer who doesn't want somebody kicked out of the country, because we're not looking at it as a comprehensive thing. I don't want to this is not just a Hispanic gang problem. Mm-hmm. This is a gang problem as a whole. It's not a Hispanic problem. The largest threat in the Mid-Atlantic region right now is not MS-13, it's not 18th Street. It's not any of the Hispanic street gangs. Our largest threat are African-American gangs, the Bloods. They've infiltrated everything in this area. They are fighting amongst themselves. People are getting caught up in the crossfire. Traditional prison gangs that we once saw, BGF, the Black Guerrilla Family, and other militant groups like that in the prison system have now spilled out on the streets. When they were arrested 20 years ago, when Shay was prosecuted in Miami, putting away gang members in Miami on large sentences, 20 years later, they're now getting out of jail. And what are they now? They're in their middle ages. What happens when they get out on the street? What do they get? They get a lot of respect. And they take that philosophy they learned on the inside, and they spread it to the outside. Next slide. Who are gang members? First of all, self-admission. Usually people don't claim to be something that they're not. Anybody in here is a member of a sorority or fraternity? You can raise your hands high. Okay, we're not investigating sororities and fraternities yet. They're not gangs.
Yes.
Yet. If the Nationals kept losing, we'd say they were a criminal enterprise, right? You guys got to lighten up today. Everybody's eating, I know. But here's what they are: a self-admission or a reliable informant of previously tested credibility confirms membership. These are the people that we're talking about that we used to infiltrate the gangs. They're called what? Snitches. Finally, somebody got it right. Somebody who doesn't watch CSI. Confidential informants. We hear all these crazy things, but they're snitches. And who are the best snitches for us in law enforcement? Other gang members? Could I infiltrate 18th Street? Could I infiltrate an Asian gang? There are not a whole lot of law enforcement officials that we do undercover operations in gang. You heard recently, a couple years ago, ATF said that they had conducted an undercover operation into MS-13 here in the District of Columbia. Wasn't quite accurate. That involved informants, not undercover officers or agents in those cases. So a lot of times we're using informants. And our best informants, generally speaking, are who? This is an interactive presentation.
Gang members.
Other gang members? Possibly. Sometimes we get arrested and we charge people and they become informants. But who are the best? Hell hath no fury like a woman scorned, right? Girlfriends, wives, mothers, who are actually concerned about their gang member boyfriends. And they end up divulging a lot of information. We use that information. Untested informants, when you call the police and say, I believe that there's a gang member living across the street from me, we take that information, then we go out and we verify the information. You've given us information. You've become an informant. And finally, confirmed law enforcement sources. Agencies across the country share information, and that includes on juveniles. And we take that information, we share that amongst each other. Sometimes getting around policies and some state laws that we have restrict us on doing that, but we try to work as well as we can in information sharing settings such as this and such as meetings that we have in law enforcement. Go ahead. Look at the profile of the gang members here in the Mid-Atlantic region. Look at the age breakdown, 9 to 40. The youngest gang member I ever arrested was 9 years old. He was arrested for distribution of marijuana while armed with a handgun. The oldest gang member is 40. If you just do the math, which is why I became a police officer, math was not my strong suit in college. The math shows that this is not just a juvenile issue, okay? And we're not just out rounding up kids. These are a lot of adults. I arrest adults on a regular basis. Excuse me, when I talk about adults, I'm talking about people into their mid and late 20s, into their 30s. They're active gang members. And that seems to be the trend here. The other trend in law enforcement that we see is the corrections aspect of this, where generally speaking, kids are going into the state prison systems or local county detention centers, and they're not gang members. And when they get out, they are. And there's been no definitive study to show the number of kids going in versus ones coming out who percentage of those which are gang members. I'd encourage this group to look into that phenomenon. I'd also take a look at the cultural breakdown. If all you see in the media is that this is a Hispanic problem, that's not true. It's less than half of our problems. Yet a majority of law enforcement resources are going towards that issue, the Hispanic gang problem. I'm telling you, as a street cop, a practitioner of this, that is not my problem. My problem out here currently is young African-American gangs. And I say young, I mean 20, they're mid-20s usually. These are the most violent that we have here in the area. I'm sorry, go back 1 second. 216 active gangs, 8,500 gang members in the Baltimore-Washington region. That's a small army. It's about the size of the metropolitan police departments of both Baltimore and Washington put together. So, and these are conservative numbers. So there are probably more out there. Baltimore recently the city of Baltimore did a study where they found that they had 70-plus gangs and 2,600 gang members in Baltimore. And that was only in 3 police districts. They have 5 more districts. So you understand that these numbers, sometimes we talked about, and Shay brought up a good point, it looks like the overall numbers are down. But the reality is those definitions have changed. Go ahead. Quick. Look at the top gangs that we have in the area. MS-13, obviously. MS-13 is sort of, because of enforcement efforts, they've kind of gone underground and covert. We don't see the traditional MS-13 type of crimes. We're not seeing those things. They've been very quiet recently. Quite frankly, a lot of them are locked up. A lot of them are in probation programs, and they're staying clean. A lot of them are getting jobs. There's a lot more advocacy programs out there for them, but we don't have that for young African-American men. We're missing mentoring programs for those type of people. But look at the different ones. Vatos Locos, Tiny Rascal Gangsters, TRG, a very violent Southeast Asian gang. STC, another hybrid gang, mixed ethnic group gangs, which we see quite frequently. Bloods in the United Blood Nation, we see those philosophies now out on the street. Southside Locos, Crips. And the BGF, the Black Gorilla family, a traditional prison gang now out on the streets. Next. And for every one of the local ones that you see up here, there's probably 4 or 5 more. 2 that you'll hear about in the upcoming years, investigations are starting to show that these guys are very active, are 2 prison gangs which are moving out onto the street. They're both white supremacist groups, the Polar Bear family and DMI, Dead Man Incorporated. There's a lot of investigations underway as to their activities, but they are basically murder-for-hire gangs. That's what they do. They're hired by Hispanic gangs, they're hired by black gangs, they're hired by Asian gangs to do contract killings. And they're very, very good at the job, unfortunately. Just a couple more slides. 3 or 4 cases here I want to put up here of note. The Samantha Benavidez murder, which Jeff will talk about, a case that we worked together, he prosecuted. The Brenda Paz murder, which got a lot of press back in 2003. In 2005, the Guest murder was the cab driver, father of 9 in Harford County, Maryland, who was killed as part of a gang initiation. In that case, those were African-American youth that were involved in that case. And then the McGinn murder in 2006, who was a corrections officer in Jessup, who was murdered by 2 gang members. And publicly, the Department of Corrections came out and said that this was not a gang murder because it didn't meet their definitions. So you see we're dealing with those definitions issues. We'll talk about that during the interaction time. And we'll talk about these things as well later on. The immigration issue, like I said, ICE has done a good job, but we are not necessarily, there's a big trend in law enforcement to go towards not deporting gang members. And I'll tell you why, because there's been no study about reentry. There's been no definitive study. The fastest I've seen is a gang member deported after being convicted of a violent crime and sentenced. He's been back in the country in 2 weeks. Okay, I've seen it as long as a couple years, but 2 weeks is the quickest I've seen them back. And other legislative efforts that are going on. We're not fans. I'd rather see somebody serve their entire sentence and then deport them after they serve their sentence, as opposed to somebody who receives a 10-year sentence and then only comes back into the country 2 weeks later after serving a year on that sentence. But we'll talk about those things during the interactive session. I think I had some information up there. I'll leave that. If you want this emailed to you, just see me afterwards and I'll email you the presentation. You can have it that way. Thank you.
Thank you very much. Next, we have Jeffrey T. Wennar. He began his legal career as an assistant state's attorney in Prince George's County, Maryland. In August 2001, he joined the Montgomery County State's Attorney Office as the gang prosecutor. Mr. Wennar brought an expertise on gangs, and especially gangs in Maryland, to this position. In 1993, Mr. Wennar authored a report on gang violence in Maryland. He has taught at police academies throughout Maryland and Virginia, has participated in numerous gang awareness presentations on behalf of the Maryland Police and Correctional Training Commissions and on behalf of the Maryland State Police. He participated in writing the National Legal Considerations Curriculum on behalf of the Bureau of Justice Assistance for both the basic and advanced training for street gang investigators. In 1995, he was recognized by the Federal Bureau of Investigation for his successful prosecution of the Hester drug gang. In 2003 and 2004, Mr. Wennar received the prestigious Frederick Milton Thrasher Award from the National Gang Crime Research Center for his superior community service. Mr. Wennar is a member of the Executive Board of the Mid-Atlantic Gang Investigators Network and is the legislative chair for the National Alliance of Gang Investigators Associations. Mr. Wennar is also currently an adjunct professor at American University. He's developed and teaching a course on gang and gang violence in America. He has been an associate professor at the University of Maryland, University College, and at Montgomery College. Please join me in welcoming Mr. Wennar.
Thank you. It is really a pleasure to be here today. I'm going to pick up where Pat left off on a few things. One of the programs that is absolutely missing throughout the United States is, as Pat said, programs to deal with young black males, but also to deal with young females. We have absolutely no programs that address the female issue as it relates to gangs. And Pat talked about Samantha Benavidez. Quickly, Samantha Benavidez was an immigrant from Peru who came to this country. Her parents had been here for a number of years. They had other children while they were here. Samantha comes much later in life, and her parents want to begin to tell her how she should run her life, how should she exist in the United States. And she basically objected to that. She basically said, look, you abandoned me, you left me with family members back in Peru, and I'm going to do what I want while I'm here in the United States. Well, she left home and she was killed. She was brutally murdered at the C&O Canal in December of 2002. Samantha's story is not an unusual story. It's a story of what has happened to a lot of immigrants who have come to this country who are unable to really adapt to what society expects of them, what their families expect of them, and how are they going to just blend in the United States. Like Pat, I'm not a fan of deportation. I think that deportation is a tool that we have as law enforcement to take the most violent criminal offenders and to, after they've served their sentence, send them back to their country. But one of the things I want to talk about, Shay started with it, is how do we deal with the problem in our community. One of the things Pat talked about was the numbers, and Shay talked about the numbers. And those numbers may be down on a national level, but you have to look at each community individually to see what that community is experiencing at the present time. Tito, who's here from Arlington, Northern Virginia, and I were down in Columbia, South Carolina a couple of years ago, and we worked on a presentation to deal with a community response to a gang problem. And through the Bureau of Justice and OJJDP and the NDAA, the National District Attorneys Association, we looked at responding to a community's needs. And some of the response, obviously, is assessment, action, organization, collaboration, community, program aspects, and measurement. And I'm going to go through those briefly with you. The assessment, you have to look at the extent of the problem in that community. What is happening in Gaithersburg may not be the same thing that's happening over in District Heights, Prince George's County. So each community has to be assessed individually as it affects that community. We have to apply a broken window theory. I mean, if we want to address a problem in our particular community, we have to decide collaboratively that we are not going to allow the problem, whatever the problem is, to exist. So if it's a broken window, and you should all be familiar, hopefully you're all familiar with the broken window theory, we fix the broken window, and the broken window doesn't become an abandoned piece of property. It doesn't become a crack house. It doesn't become a blight in our neighborhood. It doesn't drive property prices down. So we look at it from that broken window theory. We work with the community and local government. We all have to come together. Luis and I were talking before we got started that if we don't bring everybody who is affected by the problem to the table, then we're missing important people. We are missing those people, and by missing those people, we have marginalized their input. We've taken away their input, and that creates problems. The action. Once we've made an assessment, we have to do something. We have to act. We have to look at what the extent of the gang problem already is and how we're going to control that gang problem, again, in that community. We're going to have to implement gang awareness. One of the things that Pat and I have done over the years is we've gone out into the community and we've done awareness presentations. We have talked to the community about what we are seeing, and Pat gave you some numbers from Gaithersburg, what we are seeing in a particular community, what we envision is going to happen in that community unless we begin to address the problem, and how we can go about addressing the problem. And that problem may be addressed by a task force or a commission or some other group that is going to study and return a report to the community about what the problems are, how they've assessed those problems. There may be a gang unit within the police department, a unit that is specifically created to deal with the gang problem. And that unit may be created in different ways, and it may deal with gangs in different ways in each community. We're all familiar with the program that Los Angeles has used and El Paso has used and other communities have used, but we don't have to lock ourselves into those other programs. We have to create in each community a viable alternative for that community. And so what works in Los Angeles or what may have worked in Boston is not necessarily going to work in Montgomery County, Maryland, or Gaithersburg, or some other community. So we've got to look at that individual community for that. The plans must be flexible, and they must be enduring. One of the things that we have seen in law enforcement, we continue to see on a regular basis, is a lack of preparation for the future. We do something, we do it for 6 months or 10 months, 18 months, whatever, and what I like to do is refer to it as the 2 or 4 year plan, depending on how the elected officials in that jurisdiction are voted in and voted out. So we do things for a short period of time. Our duration is not long enough. The organization, stakeholders, all of the stakeholders, from the community activists, the faith-based community, government agencies, nonprofits, local business, local schools. We can't do it all. If I were doing this presentation to you 5, 10, 15 years ago, I would have told you law enforcement can handle the problem. We can't. I'm here to tell you I was wrong. That's being flexible. I'm here to tell you that we know that we have to include others in addressing the gang problem in our jurisdiction and elsewhere. Gang response model, the collaboration, a voice to all stakeholders, a sense of empowerment to those stakeholders, the sense of contributing to the solution rather than being dictated to. A community doesn't want me to come in or Pat to come in or anybody to come in and say, this is how you must do it. When you go into the community, you have to evaluate and work with those people in that community to get them to address the problem from within, not from without. And allows for a positive message to go back to that community. The community, again, government can't do it all. Tito and Luis, you both work for government agencies, but it's not the police. It's other entities within government that are participating and bringing in the nonprofits, bringing in the faith-based community. The faith-based community, I mean, think about it. The churches in a particular neighborhood know the people in that neighborhood. They may have programs within that parish, within that church community that can help the kids in that community. And how beneficial is that? I mean, just tremendous. One of the things we see on a regular basis is the faith-based community coming into court and saying, little Johnny's a good boy and little Johnny shouldn't be locked up. And what I do is I turn to that clergy and I say, well, fine, that's great. I would agree with you. Do you have somebody in your congregation who can mentor little Johnny? And so giving back to the community, from that faith-based community, having somebody within that congregation who can work with the youth, who can work with the adults, who can work with trying to get people jobs and employment is important. The program aspects, individual needs have to be addressed. The individual has to be accounted for. You can't just talk about no child left behind without looking at what the specific needs are for that specific child. Truancy is obviously a big deal, and I'm getting the 1 minute sign. Look, the last thing I want to talk about is measurement. Okay? We all the time are asked to quantify with numbers how many kids we've saved from going into a gang, or how many kids we've done this, or how many kids we've done, or how many people. Luis is here. Luis will talk a little bit about measurement. A lot of it is we have to appreciate our failures. We have to appreciate that we can't save every kid. Or we have to appreciate that I've come to an audience such as this, 50 of you roughly. I've done an awareness presentation. You've gone back. You've talked to your children, and your children haven't joined a gang. I can't quantify that, but I hope that it's working. Thank you.
Thank you very much. Okay, next up we have Carol Chodroff. She's the Advocacy Director for the U.S. program of Human Rights Watch. Before coming to Human Rights Watch, she worked as a policy consultant on federal legislation implicating children in the juvenile justice system. Before coming to Washington, D.C., Ms. Chodroff served as the federal public defender in San Diego, defending indigent children and adults accused of federal crimes. She also represented youth detained by the California Youth Authority with the San Francisco Public Defender's Office. Prior to law school, as a consultant for the Delancey Foundation, Ms. Chodroff co-authored and implemented the local action plan to reform San Francisco's juvenile justice system. Working with Delancey Street, she started the Life Learning Academy Charter School on Treasure Island, a San Francisco high school for youth in the juvenile justice system. She also spent 2 years living in South and Central America, working as a teacher and a whitewater rafting guide. Please join me in welcoming Carol Chodroff. Sorry, we have to play a little musical chairs up here.
Thank you, Erica, and thank you all. It's truly a pleasure to be here, and I want to echo Shay's comments and just remark what a wonderful and thorough and thoughtful and incredibly important report this is. So it's truly a pleasure to be here. Erica asked me to talk about my work in a couple of different areas, but primarily on the National Juvenile Justice and Delinquency Prevention Gang Task Force. And it's great to see we have in the audience one of the co-chairs of the overall National Juvenile Justice and Delinquency Prevention Coalition, which represents almost 100 organizations dedicated to children and youth nationwide. We've developed a gang task force because the gang issue has come up, and as Detective Ward brought up, there's federal legislation, some of which has passed the Senate and has been introduced in this House, varying legislation that will implicate a number of kids in this country. There's also been a lot of immigration discussion and legislation, so these issues are very timely and pertinent right now. And I incidentally just came over from the United States Supreme Court, where I heard Justice Breyer talking about the evolving standards of decency in this country, and he was talking about that in the context of the death penalty, but I couldn't help thinking that it's very much at play. The way in which we treat our youth is essentially who we are. So I don't think there could be a more important topic. Erica asked me to first mention why is it that we support certain policies and why do we oppose others. And I think there are three guiding principles that determine what legislation we support. In terms of the gang legislation, we make the choices we do based on common sense, criminal justice and juvenile justice policy, and U.S. treaty obligations under international law. And there I'm speaking also from my human rights perspective as the director at Human Rights Watch, where we do consider international standards that inform policy as well. I'm going to give you a little bit of the background about the specifics of the federal legislation first. And I'll talk about the Feinstein-Hatch bill, which did, as Detective Ward mentioned, pass unanimously through the Senate. And I'm going to respectfully disagree with Detective Ward. We vehemently oppose this legislation and are trying to stop its passage through the House for three primary reasons. I am thrilled, Detective Ward, that you're here and you brought up the gang definition. And I'd love for us to go together and talk to Senator Feinstein about an amendment to the definition. Because what you brought up, the law enforcement, may I borrow your slide for a second? That would be great. The law enforcement definition in some ways is so much better. Just so I have a sense, how many people in this room are law students who've taken a basic criminal law class? All right, so can anyone tell me what mens rea is? There's a taker. What's that? State of mind, criminal intent. Do we want to prosecute people if they don't have a criminal state of mind? Generally, under principles of criminal justice, we don't. Wisely, the law enforcement definition of a gang crime requires that the subjects have come together for the purpose of committing a crime, to commit a crime. So we're not going to just prosecute people who are hanging out on the corner for the purpose of playing basketball or listening to music. As much as we pushed and said, look, you can't prosecute kids just on the basis of their association. We need a criminal purpose. Please put that language in the statute. It doesn't exist in the federal statute. Under the Feinstein bill, which is in danger of passing through the House if we don't stop it, the definition of gang crime is a federal criminal offense. I'm sorry, not gang crime. The definition of gang is a group, formal or informal, of 5 or more individuals, each of whom has committed at least one gang crime. Does it say why they have to come together? No. That's a problem. Another problem, each of the members has committed one gang crime. Okay, I know you haven't been out there practicing yet, but can you think of a difference between committing a crime or being convicted of having committed a crime? I'll just give you this one. If you've been convicted, that means you've gone through a court process. You've been entitled to due process protections. You had a lawyer, a defense, because you can be accused of having committed a crime, but guess what? DNA evidence shows us sometimes people are accused of things which they didn't do. Some of those snitches we heard about sometimes will accuse people of doing things they haven't done. Sadly, sometimes we hear that people even confess to doing things they haven't done for various reasons. So having due process protections in place, having a constitution in place which we honor and adhere to is important. And having a definition that is so expansive that it will sweep people into the juvenile and criminal justice systems without even having the criminal intent to do so is dangerous and something I don't think we want in this country, certainly not for our kids. So the federal gang definition, as Detective Ward said, is one of our big problems with the Feinstein legislation. And on the House side, not to point fingers, but it is Representative Schiff who has introduced it. So if you want to call your member and say, please oppose that legislation, we would encourage you to do so. And there are letters in the back, and I'm happy to answer more questions about that. Second main concern with the gang legislation, the Feinstein and the companion legislation in the House, is the focus on the penalties and increasing the penalties. No, I don't think anyone disputes that people who commit crimes have to be held appropriately accountable. But first of all, we have sanctions in this country. We have statutes you may be studying about in your federal criminal law class. We have RICO. We have conspiracy law. We have 1 out of 100 people in the United States, according to a recent Pew Foundation study, incarcerated. We are the world's leading incarcerator. We don't need to spend more money on creating prisons. Sadly, in Los Angeles, there's legislation now that's increasing prison construction by $7 billion while we're cutting resources for education and mentoring and things that, as we've heard today, are things that work. We got to stop focusing on the penalties and start focusing on what we know works. Specifically with the penalties, there's an increase of penalty for life without parole, including that penalty for children in both the federal and in the Senate and the House versions. What is life without parole? That means you're sentenced to die in prison for something you may have done at the age of 16. What do we know about that? We know, according to the United States Supreme Court and adolescent brain development research, that our brains are developing until our mid-20s. You're going to hear next from, not such a young man now, but age 22. Am I right, Javier? Who still has brain development going on. I think I still have it going on, and I'm well past age 22. But my point is, people have recognized, science, well-accepted science, has recognized that the worst of the worst offenders are not children, that children are not as morally culpable. And that's not just U.S. law that says that. We are the only nation in the world right now where we have individuals serving life sentences, and we have 2,217 of them for offenses that were committed under the age of 18. No other nation in the world, as of February 2008, can have that claim. And unfortunately, the large majority of people who are sentenced to life without parole are African American and Latino. The racial and ethnic disparity is egregious. I mentioned that 1 out of 100 people in prison in the United States are locked up. If you're an African American man, that number's severely heightened. It's 1 out of 30, I believe, according to the Pew Foundation. So the racial and ethnic disparity is huge. And that's the third big problem with the Feinstein legislation and the Schiff companion legislation. The impact that it's going to have on our racial and ethnic minority groups is enormous. Now, we did see some statistics from Gaithersburg and Maryland about the numbers and the, who constitutes the so-called gang members. But those numbers differ nationwide. According to a study that came out last year from the Justice Policy Institute, while the public face of the gang problem is black and brown, the large majority, by and large, of adolescent gang members are in fact white. 40% nationwide from youth surveys of adolescent gang members are Caucasian. But those are not the numbers that are being reflected in law enforcement data. And this is not by any means to point fingers at law enforcement. We all come together to solve the problem. What is the solution? It's not locking up young people for the rest of their lives when we know that they're able to rehabilitate and to reform. It's to do what we've heard mentioned here. Focus on prevention, on intervention, on mentoring. It's focusing on things that we know work. And you're going to hear more about a wonderful bill, the alternative, the positive alternative to the punitive stuff, the Youth Promise Act. And I'm going to leave that to, luckily we have a member from Representative Bobby Scott's office here who's introduced this legislation, which now has 84 co-sponsors in the House. And by the way, the SHIFT legislation, the companion to Feinstein, is down to 24 members. 8 members of Congress have formally withdrawn from the bill, saying we don't support this anymore because of the racial and ethnic disparity it will have and the severely negative impact it will have on our communities of color. I think we're all in alignment when we know what we want to do. It's what James Baldwin said when he said, "For these are all of our children, and we all will profit by or pay for whatever they become." We have to focus on what's going to work and support and invest in our kids.
Okay, thank you so much, Carol. Next up, we have Javier Saavedra. He was born in Puebla, Mexico, and was brought to the United States by his parents at the age of 6. His entire family, except for one sister, also immigrated to the United States and gained legal status here. Javier grew up in Prince George's County, Maryland, and many people in his community and family were involved in gangs. And as a young man, Javier's goals included gang membership and attaining rank within the organization. And he became involved in the gang at the age of 11. And after struggling through illness in his family and with the struggle to support his new wife and child, Javier decided to leave the gang and turn his life around. He'll share his experiences and describe the successes and challenges he's faced in the transition from gang life. Thank you, Javier.
How you doing? Thank you. I'm talking about the kids joining immigrant kids joining the gang. Immigrant kids join gangs because they feel like in the new world, feel lost, depressed, and with no one around to help. They can't find a job, so they start hanging with people in the gang. They think it's cool because they have money, power, and respect. They want to have money, girls, sex, and drugs. They feel love in their family. They don't feel love in their family, so they look for love in their gang. Things that might prevent kids in joining the gang are jobs and after-school programs or sports activities. Parents should be involved in their kids' activities and learn who they hang with. People usually stay in the gang for a long time. Some feel pressured and feel like getting out. Others feel afraid and have seen enough. And most have families to take care of and stop hanging with their gang. Almost everyone stops or think it is time to get out like around the age of 25 to 30 years old. It is not easy to leave the gang. Some gangs kill, some beat you to death, and even hurt your family. But it's easy to stay away from them and stop committing their crimes. If you get away from them and stop being in contact with them, you would not do their crimes. When I grew up, there wasn't no place to go for help, no programs, nothing, no after-school programs. Sometimes I went to my sisters; they helped me, but they were females, not really no help. There wasn't no organization for immigrant kids around the neighborhood. Police sometimes, mostly all the police officers harass immigrants and Latino kids just because of the way they look or the way they dress. I grew up in PG County in Riverdale, Maryland. There's a lot of Mexicans around there. And just by the way you look or the way you act, they think you're a gang member. That's the way I see it. And sometimes if the immigrant asks for help for the police, sometimes they won't call the cops. If a lady is getting beat up by her husband, they're afraid to call because they think they're going to get deported, or they're going to think that they're not going to help at all. So they don't even call for help. One day I was getting off of work in Eastern Maryland, and my truck broke down on Route 50, and I stopped a state trooper for help. And for a tow truck, for me to bring my truck back to PG County. And he told me, "Can I see your ID?" And he took pictures of me because I looked suspicious. And I was asking for help, and he thought I was doing a crime. And I think it's not right because it's because the way I look, I was coming out of work and it's because they see my tattoos in my face and they think I'm doing something wrong. I was getting off of work and my truck was broken and they took pictures and all that stuff. I think that's not correct. The community does not feel right to go to the government services because they are afraid to get deported and afraid of being harassed. Everything they ask for will be denied. That's the way I see it. I'm a permanent resident, and I still get stuff denied. Some police officers ask you for green cards, not all of them, but some of them ask you for the green card just to make fun of you, especially even on your own race. You see a Spanish cop, they ask you for your papers, and the own race just try to harass you. They harass you sometimes even more than the black or officer or the white officer. The Spanish cops sometimes they harass you more than the other officers. And around my community, they harass a lot of Latinos just because the way they look, the way they act, or the way they the places they hang at. That's the way they act. The officers are Latinos are afraid of the cops, mostly because they think they're gonna be deported or be locked up for no reason. This how I got help from getting away from the gangs. It's part of my part of the help that I got. It's a little hard for me to get away from a gang because most of them are my family, like cousins, brothers, and close friends. It's hard because I see them around. I still see their parents. They go visit my families. I don't get involved in their problems no more because I have my own family and my own daughter to take care of, and I'm not involved in no gang-related stuff no more. And I feel it's time for a change because I have my own family to take care of. My transition from my gang life is I was getting involved more and more. Then God sent me an angel. I was working one day and this man approached me and asked me if I needed help for my tattoo remove and all this youth opportunity. I said yes. He introduced himself as Luis Cardona and said he was working for a youth program called Identity at Crossroads Youth Center. And he told me that he would help me with anything I needed. I was still in the gang and was harassed by the gang unit almost every day. My wife was already living with me. She inspired me to getting out the gang at first. I was tired of fighting every weekend and having problems because of the colors I represented. My mom is a diabetic and has kidney problems, drinks a lot of medicine, and has a rough life. I love my mom. I don't want her life to be rougher. So I decided to change. 2 years later, I found out I was going to be a father. That gave me more happiness to succeed for a better life. Now I see a lot of my friends going to jail and to the graveyard. So it's time for a change. I had got a lot of chances already, so it's time for a change. Now I'm getting my tattoo removed and trying to start a lowrider bike club for the youth. I'm trying to raise my beautiful, precious daughter and form a nice family with no violence around my family. I have accomplished all this thanks to the support of the staff of Crossroads Youth Center and 3 persons that I always love: my mom, my wife, and my daughter, Julissa. I had trouble getting a job because of my tattoos in my face. They always said no, so I always stayed in construction. I had problems with police too the same way because I used to be bald-headed, tattoos in my face. They always thought I was a gang member. Even they stopped me for any reason, just to investigate. It is difficult because I am a known gang member around my area, and I still see a lot of gang members and enemies that know me, and they still think I'm in the gang. Even the cops still think I'm in the gang. They still harass me and still think, oh, he's in the crime. They still investigate me and all that stuff. But it's hard. but I'm still trying. I'm still trying, and thanks to everybody that's here supporting me, and I'm going to keep doing whatever I can. That's it. Oh, and I want to show a couple of pictures of my life. This is me when I was a little baby and my mom in Mexico. That was me when I first came to the United States. My first communion in Maryland. The beginning of me being in the gang at 11. Starting to be in the gang. The old gang I used to hang with. More pictures of them. That's what I used to do, but my old tattoos that I had before, they removed. I'm from Mexico, and that was me before. My nephews, 2 nephews that I love. That's me and my new family. My new baby. That's me and my baby girl, my lowrider. That's a project I did for the youth center, Stop the Violence poster. All right, thank you.
Okay, I think we're done with musical chairs now. Thank you so much, Javier. Next up is Luis Cardona. He's currently the Youth Violence Prevention Coordinator for Montgomery County, Maryland, Department of Health and Human Services. He was formerly an adjunct professor at the Institute for Public Safety and Justice at the University of the District of Columbia. He's on the National Advisory Board of Barrios Unidos, a nationally and internationally recognized organization that works with gang-involved youth. Mr. Cardona is on the National Advisory Board of the National Latino Fatherhood and Family Institute. He has 13 years' experience as gang prevention and intervention specialist and has been instrumental in establishing several gang truces around the country with an emphasis on the D.C. metropolitan area. He's done extensive work with gangs and neighborhood-based crews and has advised foreign governments, state and federal lawmakers, policy think tanks, and non-governmental organizations on matters related to gangs. He continues to work with area youth by both encouraging positive alternatives to violence and by acting as a mentor. He is a former gang member and an ex-offender that turned his life around after being shot 5 times and losing many of his best friends to the life of gangs and crime. Please join me in welcoming Luis.
Thank you. Before I start, can we get another show of hands for Javier? Yeah, thank you. You know, Javier and I, we talked, and it's a tough decision that you have to make when you're going to make that change in life. And often we're so focused on the negative aspects of what young people or just people in general do. And yet when people have enough courage to step out there and do the right thing, you know, everyone goes on, oh, he's okay, you know, and I like to make a big deal out of everything. Most people that know me know that. And so I think the more he gets that, the more reinforcement and more strength and drive he's going to get to keep doing the right thing. So thank you for that. I don't know where to start, you know, honestly, because how many of you got to see Fruits of War this week? Right. I mean, it's so difficult to even really talk about this whole issue when historically we have often failed to address what role U.S. foreign policy has played in these headaches that we have to deal with here locally. I couldn't echo enough what the sister was saying from Human Rights Watch. I mean, but let's think about it, folks. After all, we are talking about the United States, the only nation that does not abide by the UN Convention of the Rights of a Child. I mean, that is the ultimate gauge of, you know, what a country or what a nation thinks in relation to its children. I've been asked to talk a little bit about the gangs here. I'm going to try to be very brief. Clearly, as Pat said, there's definitely no cookie-cutter approach to this. And clearly the gang issue is not an issue that just impacts the Latino community. And Lord knows we have our hands full here in the region, and if not the nation, just dealing with the diversity of the gang issue. So one of the things that I want to be clear about is that, while this is a good study, that on a national level, even locally, that we do not lose sight of the fact that this is an issue that is impacting all young people, regardless of ethnicity. And from what I've learned in my 2.5 years of being in Montgomery County now, of ethnicity and socioeconomics. I mean, it's just a different thing. Having spent so much time in D.C., where the majority of the young people that I worked with were black and brown, it's a different thing in Montgomery County and in other jurisdictions, even in the state. So I think it is imperative that, like Pat said, that we do look at how we address those needs. However, there are a lot of challenges that we have to deal with. We talked about the issue of the need for services and programs in the African American community. Well, there's still be some challenges that we had to deal with in the context of community politics. I mean, I know, even here in the District of Columbia, when you start talking about collaborations with law enforcement and other systems, one of the major things we had to overcome is the whole no snitching mentality, that's on the street. And some of you, I've been talking to you recently about that, and it's one of those things that we have to be able to overcome. Recently, we dealt with a situation, just echoing what Javier said, where there was a tension involving two groups. One had some gang members in it, but there was also students that weren't gangs, and some other young men. And what was echoed across the board was that there was this lack of trust. And I could have sat there and said, yeah, well, you know what, we need not have the law enforcement there. But that would have been the wrong approach. I had to tell the young people, like, look, your parents pay taxes. These are your servants. All right? So you utilize the resources that they have. You have to learn how to trust law enforcement. And, we're fortunate that, even in Montgomery County, in particular, a lot of our officers are willing to take that step, regardless of those challenges. I think one of the challenges for a lot of the community folks is how do we help build those bridges? But I do believe it's important that community folks help to build that bridge so that law enforcement can be trusted, because I am concerned. I don't know how many of you read the recent article that was in the Washington Post in which our state's attorney was talking about his concern about the reporting of crime in relation to this tension with the immigration issue and the federal impacts on local jurisdictions. So, yeah, those are some challenges that we're going to have to overcome. But I think, meanwhile, we still have an obligation to get folks to feel like they can trust law enforcement. And yes, law enforcement has to be consistent and fair in what they do, but at the same time, the local leadership has to make sure they make efforts to connect the people to law enforcement as well, because else this problem will continue to occur the way it has been occurring. Now, there was another question in relation to how Latino gangs are perceived in terms of the inability to be rehabilitated and things of that sort. As we can see by the gentleman who just spoke prior to me, it's a fiction. As you can see by my presence here alone, it's fiction. I mean, it can be rehabilitated. One of the challenges that we face, and I think the Justice Policy Institute study cited it, was that unfortunately many times in incarceration, you don't get rehabilitated. You're just taught to be a better criminal. I can tell you that, having experienced that myself. And so I'm not saying that there's individuals that do not need to be incarcerated, but we do need to look at those rehabilitation services within correctional facilities that help individuals to heal, to help individuals to make changes in their behavior. And that's the one thing I love about working in Montgomery County. We have a good gentleman named Art Wallenstein that runs what should be the model for corrections across this country, where he gets up, he doesn't even say he runs a correctional facility. Sadly, what he says is, I'm the largest provider of mental health services in the state. And what they do is amazing, in partnerships with community, with law enforcement, with Department of Health and Human Services, which is where I'm at, because they want to make sure that these individuals don't come back again. Now, going back to the deportation issue, it is definitely a challenge. I mean, in terms of how we deal with that, you've heard my colleagues Jeff and Pat and everyone else talk about the impacts, and yeah, we keep seeing homeboys coming back and forth all the time. I have to say, I think that to some extent the federal government is starting to make an adjustment to that, and I don't know what that means long term. But one of the things that I would say, and I'm not a lawyer, so I will say this, I'm more of a humanist, but nothing personal, Jeff. All you future lawyers here. But, in terms of where Human Rights Watch, and I'm sure they would agree with this, is that, this is what the dilemma is. That, okay, you take me who is a U.S.-born, red, white, and blue, homeboy, who made some mistakes. Had I not been a U.S. citizen, I would have been gone here, and there would have been no Luis Cardona, and it wouldn't be this work going on. And who knows? Puerto Rico is the Commonwealth of the United States, so it would have been a different thing. But bottom line, what I'm trying to say here is that it changes things in terms of sentencing, because what it does, if you saw the fruits of war and you are wary of a lot of studies, including some of the studies that Washington Office of Latin America has been doing, is that it becomes a death sentence for these individuals. So if we're saying we don't believe in the death sentence, but yet a judge says, okay, we're going to deport you, well, we are issuing a death sentence, and I think there's something that we need to talk about in relation to that. In terms of our relationship with immigration, I really haven't dealt with them personally, but I have worked closely with law enforcement, and it's taken me a long time, folks, to get to that point. I know it's taken law enforcement a long time to get accustomed to work with me, but it is a needed relationship. And I think that, I'm really excited about what the future holds for us. Some of the interventions that I would really recommend that you look at, there's a recent intervention model that was developed out of the city of L.A. through the city council and through our ad hoc committee that really looks at the wholeness and the comprehensive effort that Jeffrey was talking about and Shay was talking about, that you may want to look at it, and I can get you that information. In terms of why kids join gangs, I think Javier did a great job. A couple things that I want to touch on real quick. Remember a lot of studies recently, as a matter of fact, he mentioned Identity Incorporated. They did a study where they said that the more immigrant kids acculturate into the United States, the more likely they're going to become gang members. And so I think we have to be looking at that. We have to be looking at the role that systematic alienation plays, as Javier highlighted on. The failure at homes to provide the top, love, protection, respect, support, understanding, which are all wonderful values, but are the same values that you can find in a gang, unfortunately. In terms of best practices, obviously you saw an example of the Crossroads Youth Opportunity Center, but I've always said, and one of the wonderful things about Barrios Unidos is that you are able to incorporate culture and spirituality, which is essential, because you need that for that healing process to occur that Javier was talking about. I know I've got to wind it up, but I'm going to conclude. There's been several studies that have been talking about a lot of things, and I agree with Jeffrey. Maybe perhaps we should be looking at studies that have that really can measure what the impact has been of deportation and federal suppression laws. We should start looking at that in the context of what the impacts are for us locally. Obviously, collaboration crisis, I think we've come a long way in Montgomery County, and I'm hoping other jurisdictions could do the same thing. As you've seen from Javier, change is possible, but it begins with redemption, healing, love, and acceptance. And see, that's the real hard part, because Javier has laid out a reality. How do you overcome individuals who still see you the way you are? It takes a long time to be able to prove that. And so I think for us systematically, we have to get to the point where we embrace those changes and support it and acknowledge it. Now, the last piece is, I know one of the things your study talked about was the whole thing around USAID and some of the issues they've dealt with. I don't know if you're connected to us, but Elsa Fogenberg from Willis here, you may want to talk to her about this. But there's a coalition for the prevention of youth violence that's really doing a lot of things on the NGO level in Central America. So I guess what you might want to look at is how we could support that, because currently there's something that's being proposed by President Bush, which calls for it's called the Merida initiative, which calls for $550 million for suppression, helicopters, and all these things, but has nothing to do with prevention or intervention. And so once again, here we are going to miss a boat. Though what happens over there does have an impact here. I think law enforcement acknowledges it. Health and Human Services acknowledges it. So we have to be really, comprehensive. And then finally, with the Feinstein bill, I agree. It has to be a balanced thing. It has to be a balanced thing. And I really hope that we can really get support for the Youth Promise Act, because even if you're talking about $1 billion, think about it, folks. You're talking about half of that for law enforcement, right? But then the other half is split amongst prevention and intervention. So it's not balanced. One of the things that I was asked to do in relation to Senator Ben Cardin was to respond to that. And what I told him was we need to use the 33 1/3 funding formula principle so that is balanced. Because the JPI study said if you don't have that balanced funding approach, if you don't have that balanced approach where everyone gets a fair share of the resources, it's not balanced and it's not going to work. So I'll end with that, and I thank you very much for your time.
Thank you, Luis. We have one more presenter, and then we're going to open up for questions and answers. Rachel King is counsel for the House Judiciary Committee's Subcommittee on Crime, Terrorism, and Homeland Security. Since graduation from Northeastern University School of Law, Rachel has worked as a public defender in Alaska and as director for Alaskans Against the Death Penalty, where she was part of a successful coalition that defeated the bill to reinstate the death penalty in Alaska. After leaving Alaska in 1996, she was a teaching fellow at Temple University School of Law, where she received her LLM. She moved to Washington in 1998 to work as legislative counsel for the ACLU, covering criminal justice issues. She's published several law review articles about criminal justice issues and written 2 books on the death penalty: Don't Kill for Me, Families of Murder Victims Speak Out Against the Death Penalty, and Capital Consequences, Families of the Condemned Tell Their Stories, published by Rutgers University Press. Please join me in welcoming Rachel King.
Thank you very much. I know it's kind of hard to go last because you're getting kind of bored and you're looking at the clock to see what time it is, and this is a low energy time of day for me anyway, so I'll try to be succinct. I was very pleased to see this publication and just have a tremendous amount of respect for the students who have been working on it. Before I went to law school, I was a human rights monitor in Guatemala, and I'm very well aware of the situation down there and the years and years and years of violence that they're dealing with. But I'm more impressed because on page 6 of the study, you talk about supporting the Youth Promise Act, and that's why I'm here. I'm here on behalf of Mr. Scott, who would have liked to have been here himself, but he had a markup today on some legislation. He might still come in at any moment, in which case you'll hear from him and not me. But if he were here, he would say that there's basically 2 ways to be about crime. You can be smart on crime, or you can be tough on crime. And we know what's smart on crime. We know what works. We have years and years of research on programs that work, programs that you wouldn't even think about, things like having home nurse visits for prenatal care can influence whether or not that person enters into the criminal justice system. I mean, that's such a far-reaching concept that you have to really, if you're talking about prevention, you got to start really before birth almost. We know that our current situation isn't working all the time. Mr. Scott would not say, oh, let's get rid of the current gang laws. Absolutely not. There's already plenty of punitive legislation out there, and that can only go so far. So he's not saying get rid of the already existing legislation. He's saying let's get real and look at some things that we know work, and let's put our money there. If you look at the tough on crime philosophy, you can see that it's brought us to basically a crisis point in incarceration. We have over 2.1 million people in jails and prisons in the United States. Correct me if that figure's too low. And that's the highest rate of incarceration in the entire world. And so that's not working. We don't want a population that's in prison. Putting people in prison isn't enough to deal with the gang problem, because we know that some gang leaders issue directives from prison. So that's not even going to solve your problem either. If you put gang members in prison, they're going to continue their gang life in prison and also have it continue to impact the outside. I can't read my writing. It's been a problem ever since law school. But anyway, the Youth Promise Act stands for Youth Prison Reduction through Opportunity, Mentoring, Intervention, and Education. And many people here today have been talking about these various themes. Mr. Scott's bill is a very interesting concept. It's kind of like if I had a diagram, I could draw different circles. He also creates a lot of new acronyms, which is always good in Washington, D.C. The first one is part of his legislation creates what's called a YAP, which is a Youth Advisory Panel. And what this does, this is a group of people from the community, from law enforcement, from the courts, from schools, social service agencies, mental health providers, pretty much anybody you can think of comes together to create these advisory panels. And these panels advise the Office of Juvenile Justice and Delinquency Prevention as to what that community needs for grant purposes. And we're talking about the local level and the national level. The national level, which has more funds than the local level, but the local level knowing what it needs. Somebody said earlier, I think, that we have to create in each community a viable program that works for that community. And I could not agree any more. And that's exactly at the heart of Mr. Scott's legislation, that the community knows what it needs. They need the federal money, but the federal government can't just sit up here and say, do this, this, and this. It's got to know what each individual community needs. The next group that the bill creates is called the PCC, which is a Promise Coordinating Council. And this gives grants to local and government and Indian tribes to put in place various evidence-based programs that work. The next part that it creates is a National Center for Proven Practices. And this is an idea that we come together and share best practices. Sometimes this happens in law enforcement where they, see what works out there and get together and share it throughout the country. This is the same idea. What's out there that works? What's out there that's new and unique and original? And how can we put that information together so that we can get it out to the people who need it? And the last acronym is a YOP, which is Youth Oriented Police. And this kind of sounds like cops, but it's a training, special training for people that work with juveniles. Because I would say, I think Mr. Scott would say, that juveniles are very different from adults. You can say that the gangs involve both juveniles and adults. That may be true, but juveniles are not adults. And we've seen this, as Carol mentioned earlier, from the brain development science has been coming out, which was cited by the Supreme Court when it chose to strike down the juvenile death penalty. The juveniles are not the same as adults. And that is why, for one thing, we just can't give up on them. It's just so cynical to think that at 13 or 14 or 15 or 16 or even 19, that's it, that that's your life, that that's what your life's going to be, and it's never going to be any better or any different. We don't believe that. And so it's a really very short bill. It only has 7 sections, including the short title. And it's got, at the point, I think right now, 84 co-sponsors, over nearly 100 organizations that support it. And it's only a funding bill. It's only a funding for funding prevention and intervention. It doesn't get into, juvenile life without parole. It doesn't get into more and more punishments, because we don't need those. Those are already on the books. So please, urge you to support Mr. Scott's legislation. If you don't vote here and you vote someplace else, because of course if you vote here you don't have any voting rights, but if you vote someplace else, then please urge your congressperson to support the legislation. Thank you.
Thank you very much. This was a really productive conversation. I think that we all agree that between law enforcement and community groups. We need to keep the dialogue going. I think the difficult part now is to figure out how we're actually going to help the youth that are affected by suppression and by the lack of maybe prevention and rehabilitation programs that are out there. So I just wanted to open up the floor to questions. We have 2 wireless mics here. Yeah.
I can speak really loudly.
Okay. Thanks.
Yeah, my name is Shay. I'm from the National Center for Victims of Crime, specifically the Teen Initiative. And 2 things, 2 comments really. We put out a report recently. We did research in Massachusetts with Boys and Girls Clubs, and we titled it about witness intimidation, and it's actually called Snitches Get Stitches. And it's about sort of the effect of witness intimidation on crime reporting. Available for free on our website. I should have thought to bring some, but I didn't. So if you're interested in that. And then also, I just want to say that I think any conversation on, youth violence needs to include a conversation about youth victimization. Yeah. Because we know that involvement in gangs also increases the likelihood that someone will be victimized. Yeah. And then one final thing, any comprehensive approach to youth gang involvement, I think, needs to include a conversation with the youth. And I would urge that on the advisory panels that I think are a great idea, that you would include youth in that conversation.
Well, we tried. Does anyone? Yeah. Thank you. Would anyone like to comment on that?
Well, I wanted to just thank you for bringing up that issue, because actually that is one of the sections of the bill, is to increase funding for victim witness services. So I forgot to mention that, so I appreciate you mentioning that. And I also agree that youth should be involved in creating the law. So I'll make sure that to some degree that depends on what the communities do. But it's an excellent point.
Yeah, I just wanted to add on a local level. I mean, one of the things that we try to do, whether it's the Youth Opportunity Center or through some of our other initiatives, even with the individuals that we work with, is the whole concept even of restorative justice too, beyond so it goes beyond protection of the victim, but also how you can give back to the community. How can you give back to those that you have done wrong and hurt them? And I do agree with you 100%. That's part of what we try to incorporate even in our positive youth development intervention models as well.
Okay, thank you. Anyone else have a question?
I have a question about I know a lot of folks on the panel emphasize that youth gang violence is not just an issue among the Latino or immigrant community, but then, Javier, you talked some about specifically being harassed on the basis of race, on the basis of immigration, and that in Maryland jurisdictions, Prince George's County, Montgomery County, there may be individual cops that are hostile in that way, but as a jurisdiction as a whole, then PG County is, it's not like, say, Prince William County or something that has these explicitly anti-immigrant laws on the books. And I wonder, and there's no one here that's from a jurisdiction that has any of those local anti-immigrant laws on the books, but I wonder what y'all think about. My understanding is that generally, Prince William County law enforcement was against that bill, but it was passed by the voters of Prince, well, not by the voters, but by the voters voted in council members who had the anti-immigrant platform. And I wonder what folks think about how to reach out to the public, because my understanding is that law enforcement is on board, that it's a bad idea to have the immigrant community be afraid of contacting the police and not view the police as being partners. But how do you get that message to voters who just want to be really hostile?
Well, Luis mentioned John McCarthy, who's the state's attorney for Montgomery County. And Montgomery County, our county executive, our police chief, our state's attorney, have all said that if you're a victim of a crime, if you're a witness to a crime in Montgomery County, we are not going to ask what your immigration status is. If we don't protect each victim, then we don't protect any victim. And so in Montgomery County, it's very important that we give services to everybody. But let me play devil's advocate for a minute and maybe address for you what it is that Prince William and other jurisdictions are seeing. And this is from the LA Times. 40% of all workers in L.A. County are working for cash, not paying taxes. So when you take a number like that, whatever the percentage is in a particular jurisdiction, and services are going out that taxpayers fund, and they're going to people who aren't contributing to that tax base, there's an issue of how can we afford to continue to do this if there's not contribution. And I think that possibly your voters in Prince William County have approached it from that perspective. Certainly law enforcement understands that it's not a positive legislation. But the voters are looking at really bread and butter issues and how it affects their pocketbook. Go ahead.
I'm sorry, I was just going to briefly mention one of my favorite lines in this report is that you can't deport your way out of the problem. I think there's been a lot of agreement about that. One thing I think to her benefit, too, just in terms of federal legislation, Senator Feinstein did take out the provisions that initially enhanced penalties for undocumented individuals charged with offenses. And I think what we've seen, we talk a lot about the risk factors that put young people at risk of joining gangs, but we fail to talk about the protective factors that help youth to rehabilitate and to age out. And as Shay's mentioned, the average lifespan of gang involvement is about a year. Some of the protective factors are family ties, and by deporting individuals, or community ties, or there are a number of ties once you've built a life in going to school or having a job. Severing those ties with deportation immediately, and we know a lot of times individuals will come back, doesn't help anything. And I didn't, unfortunately, I just ran out of time, but I didn't talk about the immigration process much. But one of the things we see in the deportations hearings here is that they don't exist. I mean, people are getting deported without any judicial process, without any balancing test, and that's sort of a whole separate conversation. But I think there are things that can be done, and there is legislation on the federal level right now in the works that will hopefully amend our immigration laws to improve it. Shay?
I just wanted to comment on that in a way Carol did. That really what happens in a local community like that is that they're taking action because we don't have good, sound, coherent national immigration policy. So you have one extreme community there, and there are other communities that actually have taken a very different tack, that have said, we open our arms to immigrant families and children, whether they're legal or not. And we will provide services. We will enroll you in our schools. We will provide health services. We expect to become part of our economy, part of our life. Now, that, I think, is a more expansive vision about how you embrace this issue, get your arms around this issue, and allow kids and families alternatives to otherwise negative outcomes. But those things wouldn't be happening as much, perhaps. Everything's always local. But it wouldn't happen as much if we had good, strong national policy around these issues. So when you have a community that says, we're going to provide these opportunities for you, and you then can sit down and say, our comprehensive strategy around gangs is to involve both suppression, so that there's a clear-cut message, there's certain behavior we won't tolerate, but also these other elements that were described in the presentation today, you can bring that to life. You can say we're going to form a stakeholder group where people aren't necessarily afraid to be part of that stakeholder group when they're from that community that's most impacted by these issues. In other communities, they'd say, no way I'm going to that table. Because odds are if I get too involved, too well known, I might end up being deported because my status really isn't one that allows me to be here. So I think we need to be careful of that. When Rachel was talking about nurse home visiting programs, it's a perfect example. So we have a young woman in this country who does not have legal status. She's about to give birth to a baby who will have legal status. Yet for that woman to trust that she can come forward and engage in that kind of comprehensive program really is a stretch. Because if she lives in that community in Virginia, and I'm not saying I understand what's going on in that community in Virginia, but I'm saying if she lives in a more hostile community and she comes forward, there's a chance she also will be deported. And then what happens to her and her baby? So I think we need to create a more coherent national policy, and then community by community, state by state, will slot how we react to that population as we do any population in this country. So I look at this comprehensive strategy and say there are 3 or 4 key elements that will only happen if there's trust, if that immigrant population feels safe coming forward, and we are not there right now.
Yeah, I just wanted to add 2 things too.
obviously, Fox, CNN, and some of our other media outlets haven't helped the situation in terms of the lack of what is true and what is reality, and the often misconstrued correlations of immigration and gangs, unfortunately, which are two different things, although there are some connections on certain levels. And I think one of those things is we have to be mindful of that. Now, the second piece, though, is, again, and I don't want to, get us headed in another direction, but, this really didn't become an issue, if you think about it, until we started the deportation practices, right? But even before that, we didn't see these large waves of immigration coming in here until we started implementing the free trade agreements. And it started with NAFTA, and it's gotten worse with CAFTA. And if we are going to be serious about how we're going to address these issues here domestically, we have to be serious about how we deal with it from a foreign perspective in terms of what U.S. foreign policy is going to be around this issue. And until we start dealing with those issues, we're going to be dealing with these same, problems as it relates to immigration.
Thank you. Yes.
My name is Elsa Falkenberger, and I work with Washington Office on Latin America. Thanks to Luis for the little commercial he gave me. So just on that, specifically on that note about U.S. foreign policy and how it affects this issue, especially since this presentation more largely was about the intersection of immigration policy and the gang policy. If we are looking at, do you want music? Are you sure? I'll speak loudly. So if we are looking at that intersection, we really do have to look at the push factors that are sending. If we're looking at push factors for youth specifically, I mean, one of the most striking things about seeing this panel here is the fact that you would never see a panel like this in Central America, and that's something that we work on really closely at WOLA, and the fact that there isn't something as great as the Promise Act being offered, and that one thing that I think we can do from the U.S. perspective is really try to push as much prevention, rehabilitation, intervention, and suppression, really comprehensive models in our work with the region. So doing some sort of tandem legislation that could come along with the Promise Act that would deal with those issues in Central America is extremely helpful, and that's something that we're working on really closely. And I think it's important to mention that. I mean, your report is entirely about the region, and I think we didn't get to hear that much about it, but I think that would have been, if we could have had yet a 9th or 10th. I don't know if everyone would have been still sitting here, but it would have been really great to mention that element, because it's the push factor and the people coming from Central America. And I'm not trying to say that that immigration is a bad thing. It's just if we're trying to see, to address the fact that people don't want to immigrate here. They don't want to immigrate to the United States. They would rather stay in their own country. And if you're talking about youth particularly, and the amount of stress and the danger that they put themselves in getting here in the first place, if we could address those issues with comprehensive policies like everybody in this panel is talking about, that's one thing. And that's a whole other basket case of issues, including police reform in the region and civil society issues. And that's something that the Central American Coalition for the Prevention of Violence is dealing with, which Luis mentioned. And if anybody's interested in working with them or learning more about that, we can give you more information on that later. And then I just want to mention 3 different resources that, sorry for the longer commercial, that I think can be really useful to a lot of law students and people in the room. And so as a resource, but also if people wanted to get involved in this kind of work, I wanted to mention it. The first is we are currently working on, actually I think somebody mentioned it, the need for a report that would really look into the effects of deportation in countries such as the countries of Central America. And WOLA right now is working with a professor and a group of people from the University of California, Irvine, specifically to look at these issues. And we're starting in Honduras because it happens to be one of the most interesting centers we found, which is a a deportee reintegration program at the airport in Honduras that's run by a Brazilian nun named Valdette Lindman. And so we're doing a report basically looking at exactly, it's an amazing program, and I can tell you more about that too. But if anybody's interested in getting more involved in that, we're just getting that off the ground. And it's WOL is going to be in charge more of the policy implications side of that report. And UC Irvine is going to be working more on the research and things like that. And there are certain reports which exist already. So that's one thing. Another is we should, any minute now, I've been saying this for months, have a report coming on best practices. And there are two of the programs which are mentioned are actually the Community Crossroads, the Youth Opportunities Crossroads program in Maryland, and the CAMI program, which Montgomery is here too, is a part of in Virginia. And so that's something that we hope to be able to use as a resource for both legislatively and other systems. So be on the lookout for that one. And then the third is, which as lawyers I would really urge you guys to make use of, and I've been talking to Erica a little bit about this, is a manual, an asylum manual of sorts for lawyers who are working with youth who are seeking asylum here in the United States based on the threat of deportation would have due to gangs in Central America. So it's something, because a lot of judges and lawyers who are working on this issue don't have a lot of background on Central America in general around the gangs issue. It's something that looks at background on each of the countries, gangs issues in Central America, and successive cases that have been tried where the asylum seekers were granted asylum. So something that I hope a lot of you can use, and for those of you on the panel who are asked to be expert witnesses or things like that, we hope that can be useful. Sorry for the long.
Thank you. Sorry, Kate.
Unless anyone wants to respond, I would that. This is a question. Tell me if you can hear me. For Detective Word and Mr. Brunner, you had mentioned your support for the Feinstein-Schiff bills, and I'd be very curious to hear your perspectives on the issue that has been mentioned, whether or not the criminal enhancements for gang membership that are in those bills are something that are necessary tools to you as prosecutors and law enforcement. If you could also maybe mention briefly, I know that there was a bill that was passed in Maryland, the Maryland legislature last year, that I'm not sure how much you've made use of that already, but I know that there's very much a debate about among some of the members of the panel in terms of how whether or not that kind of element is necessary. And I know that the Feinstein-Schiff bill does have a lot of resources, but those resources are concentrated primarily on the enforcement side, not anywhere near the extent that the Youth Promise Act concentrates resources towards prevention. And so I'd be curious to hear your perspectives on that balance, and then possibly other people's responses to what you have to say.
Well, Pat testified before the Senate on the Feinstein bill. I testified in Maryland with regard to our legislation in Maryland. I think one of the things that you have to understand is, and we've addressed it tangentially, and let me directly address it, it's not just suppression, it's intervention and prevention. And we also have to look at reentry. Pat's talking about reentry to the country. I'm talking about reentry to the community when I talk about reentry. But the Maryland law, the federal law, the laws that exist in many other states are another tool for prosecutors to use for successful prosecution. You've heard me speak. I'm very passionate about what I believe is a community approach to things, but when we talk about victims and everybody, we seem to forget that a lot of the crime is directed at an individual, and that an individual, Samantha Benavides, for instance, isn't coming back, and her family will deal with her death every day for the rest of their lives. And so we have to be aware of how crime affects the individual, how it affects the community, and what resources we can use, whether there are existing legislation or new legislation, to punish the person who committed that crime. Now, a lot of you have talked about we're the only country that has the only country that has the number of people in jail for life sentences. That's a whole other issue. We're talking about right now using effective legislation to prosecute. The punishment aspect of it, the long-term punishment aspect of it, the death penalty, all of that may be an issue for another time and another debate. But if you're talking about the Feinstein, we supported it. We supported the Maryland legislation, obviously, and it just gives us more ammunition to address a problem that has become national.
If I may clarify just one thing, a couple of people mentioned that, I think Carol particularly mentioned that existing statute statutes like RICO and obviously all the criminal statutes on the books, and in terms of the baseline crimes that are being committed, that many people feel that these are adequate tools already. So if either of you have a perspective on maybe why those tools aren't adequate already.
Well, apparently they're not adequate to this degree that repeat offenders, the number of repeat offenders that exist across the country with not just gang members but crime in general is going up. Is that a failure of the criminal justice system or the legal system? Maybe it is. Feinstein-Hatch, first of all, I think the one thing that people, and you know, Carol and I respectfully disagree with each other on this, but this is a crime bill. This is not an HHS bill. For the first time in the history of the United States, a crime bill addresses prevention and intervention needs. If you want a prevention and intervention bill, introduce one. But Senators Feinstein and Hatch, which they have, Senators Feinstein and Hatch, and a coalition of some of the best minds in our government decided that the gang issue is widespread, and we need to address it from a crime perspective. But as part of that crime perspective, we understand the need for prevention and intervention. So, Luis talked about splitting it up into 33 and a third. This is a crime bill. We're lucky that we got senators to understand the prevention and intervention side of the House and put $400 million in there. Okay? If they want to introduce new legislation, then that's what it's about. But we need to go after the most violent criminals. There are some criminals who and we can all disagree or agree on this, there are some who do not want to be reformed. Whether we want them to be or not, there are some that don't want to. And they'll tell you that. Case in point, Ricky Escobar. I started investigating him when he was 13 years old. At 16, he went over to Langley Park and he stabbed another gang member, a rival gang member, to death with a screwdriver. Ricky was in and out of the juvenile justice system. He was in and out of prevention and intervention programs. Finally, what he said when he was arrested was, "So what? I'm going to jail." The last 36 hours I spent, if you saw the news, about the murder of Lindsay Harvey in Gaithersburg. The last 36 hours, literally sleeping in my car, working the case with Montgomery County Homicide, we made an arrest of a guy who we thought, this guy is, I don't know how to explain it to you, this guy is dumb. He's dumber than a box of rocks. He's not a very intelligent human being. And he shot to death a random victim. She just got out of her car from a night out with her friends, was walking to drop some trash off in the trash can. She was robbed and shot. The guy who did it was a lot smarter than we thought he was. Also may have some possible gang ties. What do we do for those victims and this victim's family? Feinstein-Hatch addresses that fact. If he's got gang ties, then we'll go after him. Feinstein-Hatch also addresses where RICO sometimes is not very good at utilization. It addresses the definition of what a gang is. Sometimes RICO, to put together what is a criminal organization, it takes a lot more in depth to do a RICO case than it does to use a gang act. Now, Rod Rosenstein, the U.S. Attorney in Maryland, used it against the MS-13 different cliques in PG County, successfully prosecuted those people. But we have to understand that the law enforcement role in this is we have to arrest violent offenders. What happens to them when they get into corrections and what happens to them later on after they serve their sentences, I'm all for rehabilitating somebody when they get on the inside. If a judge, and Jeff will tell you this, if a judge sentences a juvenile to juvenile detention in Montgomery County or in the state of Maryland in general, and he's a gang member, and he wants to sentence him to a diversion program, do you know how many exist in the state system? 0. If we're really going to get tough on it, then why don't we create state agencies that agree with that? The juvenile justice system in Maryland is broken. It has been for a long time. Thus the closure of some of the larger, the Hickey School and what was the other one we closed down out in Western Maryland. And then those things we're trying to reform. We brought in a secretary under the governor from the outside to reform that. So, we don't, the Maryland gang bill is basically toothless because we want to go after gangs in organized crime fashion, to go after their finances. We can't do that. We want to put other predicate acts. Gang members aren't just about drive-by shootings. Sometimes people don't realize that. You know what gangs are into now? Credit card fraud, identity theft, computer crimes, stuff that we don't call traditional gang crimes. And that affects all of us economically. And the laws in Maryland don't allow us to do that. They don't allow us to fix that. Feinstein-Hatch addresses that. We support it, but it's a crime bill. So let's If we want to do more for prevention and intervention, introduce it through HHS. Introduce a new bill. The Promise Act, all those. This is a crime bill that I would submit does see the need for a joint comprehensive approach, not just the level of funding.
Yeah, I just wanted to add, too, in terms of what Pat said that I think was a good point, is that the reality is that very seldom has Health and Human Services, I'm talking about on the federal level, other than when the Surgeon General said youth violence, right, is a public health issue. And yes, the public health folks have to take more leadership on this. I've said it very often that, for the most part, youth violence, gang violence is a public health issue, but becomes a public safety issue when we don't invest in the resources, and then they end up dealing with Jeff or Pat. And so part of what I believe needs to happen is that we need to have HHS on a federal level take a more active role on how they address these issues from a policy perspective, and it should no longer just be the criminal justice, traditional criminal justice entities taking the lead. That's what's happened. I mean, if you look in our jurisdiction, or even around the country, most of the gang coordinators who are more into the prevention and intervention still fall under law enforcement. I'm the only one that falls under Health and Human Services, and it's no criticism to my colleagues because what they do is great work. But again, in other jurisdictions, they just don't have the policy or the frame of mind to really say, you know what, we need to take a more active role to strengthen what we do in prevention and intervention to address this issue.
Can I make just one brief point? This is something I learned when I came to Washington. I had no idea, and this is on sort of the balanced approach, because I actually don't think we're that far apart. We all agree this is a crime problem. I think we differ in terms of approach. I mean, the hope is to prevent it before it stops. No one disputes the fact that we have to hold perpetrators accountable, and we do have statutes that are used. But when we talk about money that's authorized in a bill, when we talk about the $4 million that are allocated in the Feinstein bill, that's fake money. Communities are not going to see a dime of that until that money is appropriated. What happens in these balanced bills, and the 94 crime bill is the best example of that, it gets up to appropriations. $400 million for prevention, but what gets appropriated? What gets funded? All law enforcement. Prevention gets nada. So we have a balanced approach only if we have a prevention bill that gets funded. Because, a bill that recognizes that children are not small adults, that exactly, Detective Ward, as you say, when you have a juvenile justice system that fails to recognize that children are different, that as the Center for Disease Control recognized, when you transfer young children into the adult criminal justice system, you increase violence and make the crime problem worse, then we've got a real problem. So it's important to have a bill that's devoid of duplicative penalties, which do already exist. The author of RICO said this is an ideal statute to prosecute gang crime, and it does get used. We already spend $65 billion every year in this country on incarceration. If we want balance, which, in theory makes sense, then we need a strictly prevention bill. Thank goodness we have Representative Scott, who's introduced it in the House. We're hoping to get it passed in the Senate. We really hope we can have law enforcement support for the bill, because I think we really are all on the same side. We want to stop the crime problem.
Thank you. Yes.
First of all, I want to thank the panel. My name is Richard Flintroff. I'm with a nonprofit organization in D.C. called the Healthy Families Thriving Communities Collaborative Council. And we've been tasked by the D.C. City Council to generate a study which would try to examine best practices and the potential impact on Washington, D.C. gang activities. So I just want to let the students who are here know that we're going to be seeking some interns to assist with that project, and there will be opportunity for some paid internships. The report's due the end of September. And I also want to let the panelists know that a number of you, I think, will be needing to tap into as we proceed with this work. So thank you very much for coming. I've got cards here if any of you are interested afterwards.
I want to comment just briefly on that last dialogue, and I know you want to ask your question. And it deals with whether it's the Promise Act or whether it is a crime bill that has prevention and intervention. So we're always going to fight this battle about whether there's appropriation. So even if the Promise Act is authorized, we don't know what money would be appropriated to it, even if it's a standalone. I think it's really important for law enforcement, for the National District Attorneys Association, International Association of Chiefs of Police, to take positions, which I think they have, that we can't arrest and we can't imprison our way out of this problem, and that any legislation that is authorized must include an appropriation, therefore, that has all of these different aspects funded. There's hardly a police department in this country that will say that they will be able to suppress their way out of this problem. When Los Angeles first undertook to implement the Boston Gun Project, they left out the front end when they launched their suppression piece. It cost them dearly. So I think most law enforcement will support this. Getting into the weeds, though, as we started to do, which I'm not going to take us back into those weeds, about definitions of gangs, is where we need to spend some time to make sure we're not overly inclusive, to make sure we're fair. We don't sweep up too many young people into this category in a way that they're facing mandatory sentences or longer sentences than we need on the books. I'm sorry for that interjection.
Now I'll add something to that. Just on the issue of what's left out, funding-wise, Defender Services haven't been mentioned. And if you fund a law enforcement bill with big bucks, and you don't fund the Defender side, you're going to have a lot of disenfranchised and unhappy youth. Right. Because they perceive when they're getting treated well by Defender Services funding, and when they're not. My question, though, is for Javier. I want to know what you will do differently as a parent from what your parents did.
What I'm going to do different is be there for my daughter. Like, I had both of my parents here with me in the United States. They came with me. They brought me with them. But my mom always been sick with diabetic since she's been here. She always took me to the doctors. I always been with her to the doctors. And only my dad, he wasn't with me. He didn't have good communication with me. And what I'm going to do different is I'm going to be there for my daughter the way my parents wasn't there. He was there for me, but not exactly like the way I wanted him to be with me, like show me love, like take me to places, or let's say like I had an older brother, all the attention went to my brother, and my brother, he did worse stuff than me. Still the attention went to him. But what I'm gonna do different is take care of my daughter, give her the love she needs, and show her the mistake that I did, and show her the different ways to go in life. Her mom, she's in college, and I'm gonna try to keep up on my education too, and we're gonna show her the good way to get up there, but showing all the love that my parents didn't show me. I think that's the only way, is showing the love and being there for your kids.
Did you feel isolated or different at all because you weren't from this country? I mean, how much, like, were you aware that your parents weren't fluent in English and that kind of thing?
Yeah, I feel different and afraid sometimes because when I went to school, people used to harass me, jump on me, or different stuff. But I think sometimes they helped me to keep like going stronger and stronger, and never gave up, and things that I wanted to do, keep doing it, and don't be afraid of doing. I think they gave me more power to not be afraid of them, because sometimes basically in the community I grew up, it was black against Spanish. A lot of black people used to come to me, beat me up. I went back the next day, the same thing. Like, they keep going back and forth, but I was afraid, and I kept doing, never went with my head down, holding my head up, and try to do everything the next day. Don't give up. But it was difficult because of the language and the way we were treated. But it was hard, and you learn from what happens to you. Keep going, something new.
Thank you. Yes.
I was just wondering, I don't know a lot about this issue, but I've been hearing a lot about sort of reframing the role of a gang. So not just try to get people out, but to reframe that message. And I don't know a whole lot about it, but if you could talk, if you know of any communities that have tried to do it, what's that strategy? Is it feasible? Is it sort of way by, in the sky? Is it an approach? I don't know. So you can talk to that just as a practitioner.
Yeah, I mean, it's been a part of a 15-year journey for me. It is very challenging. I've seen guys around the country that have tried to do it, and we do become victims. I mean, I can't even really, when I go back home to New York, I can only hang out for so long because I've had a green light on me for a long time, because word got around that I was helping out, guys who were in gangs that were rivals. And so, it is a challenge. But I think part of the biggest challenge that we face is once they go through the process that Javier has gone through, is how do we as a community embrace them? Often I've seen young men who fall back to their old patterns because they just get sick and tired of the same treatment. Javier was telling me this morning, he's like, he's got more harassment now than when he was doing the wrong thing. And it's imperative for us to help them navigate that, And I tell all the guys that, you know what, you got to also remember you did some things that were wrong in the past. And so you're going to be held accountable for a while. People are going to sit back and be watching you and, making sure that, you're not playing them and you're not trying to beat the system, because it happens. Jeff and I will have conversations by individuals say, hey, we'll change, and then they're back in the courtroom again, And it's not a magic wand that makes it go away over a while. But it really is important that whatever effort you have, it does include that component that I was talking about that has to do with healing. And that healing, it starts with oneself, and then healing, in terms of how how your role changes in the community. And it's interesting because in the 15 years when I started doing this work, the average age of the guys that they wanted to get out were in their 20s. And I'm now coming across 14 and 15-year-olds that want to get out and have experience just as much as those guys that were in their 20s. And I think that there's not enough in place right now. I mean, Pat just talked about in juvenile justice in the state, there just is not enough in place right now to meet a lot of those individuals that want to make that change. Because there's probably hundreds, if not thousands, of Javier's out there. But the question is, does their community have, those support systems in place? I mean, obviously there's people who have the mentality and the wherewithal to understand that we need to have policy that nurtures that and supports that. But it has to go beyond policy to now, the funding of the services. Now, one last thing that I want to mention, though, and, my colleagues from Northern Virginia, we're meeting this Friday. As we progress in what we're doing around intervention, it actually creates other needs all of a sudden. Whereas before we weren't successful in getting individuals to now make that decision to either get out or to become inactive gang members, well, that's happening. But now as a result, now we have individuals whose life are in danger too. And so we have to figure out what are we going to do with them, because we can't use the same resources that we will use for a witness protection plan. And, even in our county alone, we've got issues around homelessness and homeless families. So how do we begin to deal with individuals that we have to relocate to other communities? And I know I've recently met with OJJDP and some officials to talk about the possibility of a pilot, and I'm talking to my colleagues because we all agree that's a need that we have. We just don't know what that looks like. And, the good thing is we've engaged our state's attorney's office, our police department, and trying to frame what that's going to be and what it's going to look like.
I want to caution. I'd like to make a comment on that, Susan. I want to caution you when you talk about gangs trying to change their identity, so to speak, try to reform themselves or remake themselves into something that's good, or how do we make gang members better? You have to be very cautious when it comes to, two things come to mind. When the Latin Kings tried to say that they were going mainstream, we're going straight. And then all of a sudden they get taken down in a large federal investigation where they were continuing, as they were going straight and taking care of the community, they were continuing to deal drugs to that same community, continuing to kill people in that community, continuing to kill rival gangs in that community. So you have to be careful with that. The Gangster Disciples tried the same thing. And
conservative vice lords.
Conservative vice lords tried that in the Chicago area. At the same time, they were going mainstream and meeting with elected officials and sitting down working out truces. They were putting contracts out on rival gang members, putting contracts out on cops, putting contracts out on family members of rival gang members. So you have to, you have to be very cautious. Javier, I think, is a great example of when he talks about, he uses the term harassment. Yep, do the cops stop Javier? They probably stop him all the time. That's what we get paid to do. And Javier is probably, are there bad cops out there? Yep, there sure are. There are bad cops. There are cops who violate the Fourth Amendment or stretch it, as Jeff likes to say, it's just a guideline for me. We stretch it sometimes. That's a joke. You can lighten up. Okay? But what we do is a guy like Javier, I can guarantee, and I'm not going to speak for him, but I can guarantee, I've debriefed hundreds, if not thousands, of gang members, and when I talk to them, one of the things they say is, when I get out of the gang, I want to get out of the gang. And then I still see them living in the same neighborhood. How hard is it to get out of that gang unless you relocate? Sometimes you have to geographically, physically remove yourself from that area. One of the things that we did in law enforcement, we approached the Archdiocese of Washington. The Vatican City crew's in town. I don't know if they're a gang. They wear colors. Okay, the leader's here. I saw them throwing some hand signs. Okay. But what we've done is we approached the Archdiocese and we said, hey, look, we'd like to establish some safe houses where kids can, if they want to get out of the gang and they're serious about it, then they're going to move. And they're going to go to a safe house. They're going to finish their education. They're going to learn job skills. If they're like Javier, a new parent, they're going to learn parenting skills. They're going to become productive members of society. But you got to move them out of. You got to move them out of here. One of the things, I had the FBI, not to knock on my federal brethren, if any of them are here, they called me one day and they said, hey, we have a witness we want to put in witness protection. We want to put him up. It's an MS-13 case. And we want to hide him. And we're thinking about hiding him in this neighborhood. Well, what do you think? I said, have you done your research? Where do you want to put them? Down on New Hampshire Avenue in Langley Park. Really? Yeah, there's a hotel down there. Okay. The witness won't last 24 hours, right, Javier? Yeah. Somebody's going to know. So we're trying to re-educate even ourselves in law enforcement. And then you know what happens? Law enforcement guys retire. Prosecutors retire. People move out. Luis gets a new job. And then we have to re-educate ourselves all over again. And the people who've been doing this for years and years, I finally have asked to step out of the gang business. I've been doing it for a long time, and it's time for me to move on and move on to other endeavors. And what's going to happen is we're training a new crop of cops to come up and teach them how to be cops, teach them how to be gang cops, and teach them how to do this. They don't all agree with me. You know what cops think and what we think, right? We want to lock them up, hook them up, throw them in jail, and then deport them. That's going to solve the problem. Does it solve the problem for the Montgomery County gang member who was arrested, incarcerated, and deported and went down and killed a PNC officer in El Salvador, part of the Salvadorian National Police? He went down there and killed them. And then several days later at his funeral, you talk about getting harassed, Javier, at his funeral, it's illegal to be a gang member or to associate with gang members in El Salvador. At his funeral, 180 people attended. The PNC retribution for the killing of their officer stopped, detained, and arrested all 180 people at the funeral. Men, women, and children. Because why? They're associating with a known gang member. He's in a coffin and he's dead, but you talk about stretching the law, they stretch the law. So I'm a firm believer, and we're doing this now in law enforcement, of supporting our law enforcement brethren in Central America and South America, to give them the resources they need to do their jobs and to be an impact on their community down there so it's not a problem for us here. To make life in El Salvador, Guatemala, or Honduras more livable so people don't want to leave.
That's right.
And that's what we need to do. And we agree with that in law enforcement.
Okay, thank you. Javier, did you want to respond to the challenges of moving away from a gang, especially when some of your family members are involved, and how that's worked out for you?
Yeah, it is a challenge because basically all my family is gang related, like cousins and brothers and all that stuff. But like he said, if the only way you want to get out, you just move, get away from them, stop hanging with them, don't get connected to them. Like a couple 2 weeks ago, one of the gang I used to hang with, he got stabbed in Parkdale High School. 15-year-old. He for me, he wasn't a gang member. He was a little kid. MS-13, supposedly they MS-13, but they killing little kids, raping little girls. That's what I think. And it's hard, but I think like that's the way he said, is move, stop connecting to them, and that's the only way. Basically, all the gangs, they're going to come at you, kill you, hunt you down, whatever. But if you get away from them and don't have connections to them, they're going to leave you alone, or they're going to forget about you. They're going to try to get more people in that gang and forget about you.
Okay.
That's what I think.
Thank you. We have time for one more question.
Just a comment, and it's interesting on this getting out, please, because we're focusing probably on the 1 or 2% deep in gang members that decide to get out that are truly threatened, dying, or getting killed. Otherwise, the 17-year-olds that are getting out at a great rate, we'd have dead bodies all over Northern Virginia, Maryland, and D.C. because they got out and they were killed. So we got to be careful. People do get out all the time with some threat, but minimal physical threat to them, and we do need to focus on those 1 or 2% that need to be relocated. just looking at this report, and I keep hearing around that there's not resources. And I think I just would say, look deeper than if a program says the gang recreation center, or the gang learning center, or the gang high school, or the gang family parenting class, or the gang social service center. Because all of those centers, if they're operating effectively, are doing gang prevention work. An effective school system does gang prevention work every day. An effective police department does gang prevention work every day. Boys and Girls Club, gang, they don't call it that all the time, but that's what it is. It's looking at those risk and protective factors that exist in a kid's life. If they're connected to school, have a solid family, feel connected to their community, are involved in positive activities, which those organizations represent every day, they're in that. The likelihood is they won't ever get in a gang, and if they are, they'll feel comfortable coming out. So in this report, I just noticed that there is a lack of that. I would say take a harder look at those risk factors for why kids join gangs, and see if there is programming that address those needs, like substance abuse, mental health, domestic violence in the homes, which are rampant in these types of environments, and see if there are those programs in specific communities that address them.
Can I respond to that really quickly, too? Okay. Just to respond to that, when we did our research, we spoke with a lot of service providers and gang-involved youth all around Maryland, D.C., and Virginia area. And a lot of times what we saw was the programs, like you mentioned, specifically actually Boys and Girls Club, a lot of the educational programs, et cetera, they don't want a lot of the hardcore-looking gang youth in there because they think they're going to taint or somehow corrupt the other kids who are involved in the program. Also, when they're getting federal funding or state funding or local funding, they have to have a certain success rate, kids who pass through an entire program, if it's a treatment program, for example. So a lot of times they're going to skim the bad kids off the top because they don't want kids who are likely to fail. And so while it's true, yes, they should be doing gang prevention, once a kid starts to get involved, it's a lot harder for them, this is what we found locally, to take advantage of those standard general services that usually are available to youth. So
I think it goes back to what Shay was saying, it's a trust issue.
Yeah.
Want to come into those services and getting them. But a 10-year-old kid that shows up at the rec center tonight and is involved over 2 or 3 weeks, you've prevented that kid from joining the gang. That's not going to show up on a survey. That's not going to be they ever got in. But we may have prevented them from the gang tonight, using substances tonight, getting pregnant tonight.
Well, as long as it's effective, like you said, because if you send a kid to the teen center and he sits there for 2 hours and doesn't do anything but watch TV and play ping pong, that's not an effective program. Mentoring programs, teaching the kids skills.
If that happens one night, if that one night that kid comes to that program to watch TV and the next night he starts talking to the counselors there, and by the end of the month that counselor and him have built a relationship, then that TV watching for 1 or 2 nights is effective.
Let me make an observation, because I think what we just witnessed is a conversation that, as Jeff was describing, when you convene a stakeholder group in a community that looks at its issues that it's facing, this is the kind of conversation you end up having. What are the numbers, right, Jeff? What does our data tell us about who our most at-risk kids are that we can stop from going down that pathway? Who are the kids who are the wannabes on the fringe of the gang? Who are deeply entrenched in the gang? What are then the strategies we use as we balance a very comprehensive approach to address gangs in our community? And then you have that dialogue. And you say, well, which are the organizations that really can run a program that can take some of the kids who are actually in the gang already, who won't fear their entry, and the other ones that are on that pathway who just need an after-school program, some opportunity and skill set to prevent even wanting to go into a gang. So I think this is a perfect example of what would happen in that stakeholder group. The key for this discussion is, how do you get this population, this immigrant population, to come and be involved in that group? How do you build that trust? But that's even more difficult than it normally would exist, even without an immigrant population. That's the work this report challenges us to do.
Okay. We're going to have to wrap up now, but I want to thank you all very much for joining us today, and thank each of our panelists. If you can join me in thanking them again. And Please remember to put your email on the list if you'd like us to send a link to the full report.
More recent, in 2004 data.
Yeah, well, the 2005 National Threat Assessment that the National Black Investigators, BJA funded, put the numbers back over the 800,000 mark, and then there's a current one underway that BJA is also sponsoring.
BJA or BJS?
You know what, I mean, it's...
But is it supported by BJA?